Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today I want to talk to you about feeling uncomfortable in binge eating recovery. And I actually think this might be one of the most important videos I've made so far. I think it was a key piece in the puzzle for me, and it was one that I probably found quite late, but it was a real game changer when I really learned this idea and this concept around discomfort and what we make it mean when we feel uncomfortable. So if we look at the binge eating cycle, there's a few stages that are really uncomfortable, particularly so. So there's the feeling deprived, feels pretty uncomfortable. Those overwhelming urges to binge where all you can think about is food, and there's sort of an agitatedness that comes along with that. That's pretty uncomfortable. And then of course the aftermath of a binge where you're feeling horrible about yourself. There's the guilt, there's the shame and all of that. All of those experiences are really uncomfortable to experience. And then there's the action stages, we might call them, which is the binge itself and the part afterwards where you're either restricting and controlling or you're just telling yourself you are. So if you feel really bad, you're full of guilt and shame, you will make promises to yourself that this is the last time. You will make these plans in your head about how perfectly you're going to do it from now on. And that's a way to relieve the discomfort of the guilt and shame, right? And the actual binge is a way to relieve the discomfort of feeling deprived and experiencing an urge to binge. So the whole cycle is around feeling uncomfortable and then trying to correct those feelings through behaviours that we know are pretty self-sabotaging and lead you to overall feeling even more comfortable. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of showing how the vicious cycle feeds itself. The sense that you don't feel good, so you think you need to do something about that. Then you do something about it, and then you don't feel good about that. So you need to do something about it, and then you do something about it, and this is where you're going into the binge, to the restrict, binge, restrict. That's where you're in the cycle. But I suppose if binge eating is an uncomfortable experience anyway, like there's no way to avoid feeling uncomfortable in this cycle. So in order to get out of it, it's going to feel uncomfortable to get out of it. But it's slightly different because there's an element of choosing your discomfort. So I'm somebody who really doesn't like the cold. Like, to me, when I feel cold, I feel a bit emotional. I feel like crying at times. And I'm somebody who often runs on the colder side of the spectrum anyway. And I have recently started getting up early in the morning and swimming in the sea. Now, for me, that's a really uncomfortable thing to do. But there's an element, because I'm choosing it, that makes it a bit easier. This is not something I'm being forced to do. I'm making a choice. Now, why would I choose to do that? So I've been recently looking into, there's been some interesting research out there around cold therapy and what being exposed to the cold can do for our mental health and our physical health. And if you're interested in more of this, check out a guy called Wim Hof. He's all over YouTube and social media, so you can look into the research and the science going on around that. Now, what happens when I do it is that I have a great time. It's difficult getting myself out of my bed early and getting down when I know I'm going to be cold. But there is something incredibly satisfying about it. I've chosen it. And so part of it for me is around, I want to be someone who's a bit more comfortable with the cold. I don't want the cold to control me. So why am I using this as an example? Well, it kind of made me think a bit about food as well. This idea of like, I don't want to be controlled by food. And where food has been controlling you, in order to break that cycle, is going to involve choosing your discomfort. And that's the difference. That's the empowering part. So what are the discomforts that you may have to choose? Well, one, experiencing binge urges without acting on them. Now that one can seem quite scary, and some people are like, white knuckling through a binge urge is not a great idea. Because eventually it just seems to build and build, and it will get you in the end. This is why choosing the discomfort just creates a whole different energy around it. So if you experience an urge to binge and you think, great, I'm going to choose to really experience what this feels like, you're moving towards it. You're not moving away from it. You're not in conflict. You're kind of saying, like, come on, like, do your worst. The worst is feeling really uncomfortable, right? But when you are choosing that, there's something waiting for you on the other side. So, like with the swimming for me at the moment, there have been many mornings where I've not particularly wanted to go, but whenever I've gone, I've always been glad that I've gone. I've always felt great, I felt more alert, I felt a sense of achievement, and it feels really good. And I think it was the same for me as well, like with binge eating. Like any time that I decided to choose to experience an urge and not act on it, I always felt great about it. The urge passed and I would feel great. There was never a case of like later on in the day looking back at an earlier urge and thinking, oh, I wish I'd binged on that. Like I would go to bed just feeling really proud of myself. And that would reinforce this idea that choosing the discomfort is a great thing, because there's a reward to choosing discomfort. Doesn't mean that you won't feel discomfort again, but that choosing it builds a sense of mental strength and resilience, and a way of, like, for me, I just felt like I was living more in line with my personal integrity because I wasn't being controlled by compulsion or fear. And I think it's interesting that when we think about this in line with something like intuitive eating, and the idea with intuitive eating of giving yourself permission to eat what you want, some people get a bit stuck here because they have a craving or a desire for a certain food that perhaps is a bit risky for them. And they have this desire and it feels uncomfortable to say no to having that food. So because it feels uncomfortable, and intuitive eating is about being more comfortable with food and being freer with food, for some people then and certainly I've been here, the thing is I'm then saying to yourself, well, I shouldn't deprive myself, so I should have the food. And then you have it, and it feels uncomfortable not to have more, and you have more, and before you know it, you kind of slip into a binge, and it's those binges that take you by surprise. Sometimes you know a binge is coming, and sometimes it just seems to take you by surprise. So I think the key difference in that moment here to help you figure out what's going on is that when there is a desire to eat something, to ask yourself, do I really want this food? Or is it just too uncomfortable to say no? And I hope that makes sense, because there's a sort of subtle difference between that. And one of the ways to know if you really want the food is to say, have the food, but have it without distraction. So you're not watching it in front of the TV, you're not watching it while you're on your phone. That will help kind of tease out what's going on. Because if that feels really uncomfortable, then there may be something going on beyond just wanting the food, right? Because sometimes you just want some cake and you eat some cake and it feels good and it feels satisfying. Great, that's what intuitive eating is all about. But when there's sort of a binge urge rumbling, it's not about the cake, it's about not wanting to feel this discomfort. And that's the distinction that we need to try and make when it comes around the permission to eat. Otherwise, for some people, permission to eat continues as binging. And you see people saying, just keep going, it'll stop at some point. But if it's coming from a different place, if it's coming from avoiding discomfort, and that discomfort isn't going anywhere, then potentially your eating may not settle down just with the permission part of intuitive eating. And I think, this almost comes into this existential issue around like what it means to live and what life is all about. For most people watching this, I imagine you live in a first world country where life is about being comfortable. We don't have that many opportunities to feel uncomfortable because our lives are constantly being made more physically comfortable. And so we're also fed this message that, like, if you don't feel good, something's terribly wrong. Somehow you're not doing life properly if you're not feeling good about your life. And then that can lead to people seeking out these sort of compulsive, self-sabotaging behaviours just to try and feel good because they think they should. So there's an enormous amount of self-judgment that can be at play here when it comes to feeling uncomfortable. It can feel like something is wrong and that means this feeling needs to be chased away as soon as possible. But actually, like, life is uncomfortable, you know. And actually, I think I want to leave it on a quote from the Princess Diaries that I'm going to slightly amend, that Wesley says, which is, "Life is uncomfortable, Highness, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something." So on that note, I'll see you on the next video.